Now, I've not really talked about this much on this channel before, and definitely not recently, but I absolutely love TF2. From 2013 to about 2016, it was practically all I played, and depending on how I feel on the day, it might beat out Long War as my favorite game ever. I've sacrificed around 3,000 hours to it since 2013, which is just over a full year of 8-hour shifts. Safe to say, I'm a bit of a fan. A few days ago, Valve did a Valve, and with absolutely no warning at all, just dropped the SDK for TF2 publicly for free. For the non-technical, this might not sound like a big deal, but if I expand the abbreviation of SDK to its full name, Software Development Kit, you might start to get the idea. It's what Valve used to make the game, available for everyone, for free. Before I get into the full ramifications of what that means, some history. TF2 effectively ceased development at the start of 2018 with the release of the update colloquially known as Blue Moon. Since this, there hasn't really been any significant changes to the game. In 2020, TF2 got infested with cheaters on basically every server, as people realized Valve wasn't going to do anything about them. Valve, already being done with TF2, pretty much let a third-party contractor deal with the problem. Gradually since then, TF2 has received a steady supply of updates to bring it more in line with the rest of the industry. The most notable being its move to 64-bit last year, bringing TF2 kicking and screaming into 2010. Other highlights include allowing 100-player servers and a good chunk of very funny patch notes. Shunick has videos covering all of these if you'd like to know more. For what it's worth, the bot-apocalypse seems to have gone, though if this is because all the accounts got banned or because the operators got bored is anyone's guess. That brings us to the most recent and most important update, before the SDK anyway, which was the official support for VScript. For almost 2 decades, people have been making TF2 maps in Hammer, and anything complicated had to be done with its incredibly unimpressive triggers. Now, finally, people can use actual code, which both allows for much more complicated things to be made, as well as making it more accessible, because, seriously, Hammer sucks. That kind of puts the release of the SDK under a new light. It's not completely out of nowhere. For the last couple of years, Valve has been gearing up to cast away its forgotten child and let it be raised by whoever it may float into. The final release of the last comic is even further proof of this, as it's clearly a send-off. Everything got wrapped up, everyone is older, much time has passed, and, I mean, look at that frame. You could not scream, TF2 is over, any louder. And honestly, what a wonderful run it was. For one, it started the careers of a lot of people whom I hold very, very dear. The game itself was so incredibly influential that it is basically single-handedly responsible for the entire live service industry as it is today. Video on that here if you're interested. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that it might also have the single largest cultural impact of any game ever. To count up the views on every video centered around the mercs would get you in the billions very, very fast. Though it is disappointing, it's almost brave of Valve to not tie themselves to it any longer, especially in the modern day where it seems like developers are forced to remake their first game over and over again. To instead say, we're putting this in the hands of the people who love it so much, and to move on to better things. You can call Valve a lot of things, but I don't think greedy is one of them. Let me try to put into perspective why. If you tried to get access to the SDK like a week ago, it was technically possible. Licensing an SDK from a developer isn't completely unheard of. Respawn even did it to get the source engine for Titanfall. It's only unfathomably expensive. Note for pedants, the examples I'm about to give are not strictly one-to-one comparable, as licensing TF2's SDK is not the same as licensing a source engine SDK, but getting the SDK for a fully complete game is enough of a goldmine in and of itself that I think it's a fair comparison. Respawn's fork of Source, called Resource, is still used today for Apex, though as for how that licensing deal works isn't publicly known. We can speculate prices with Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which came out less than a month ago, because it's based on a licensed version of CryEngine, and the budget for the original game, which is where they would have gotten access to the engine in the first place, was only a casual $36 million. The sequel, still on the same engine, was only a little higher budget with about $40 million. Shame it's one of the most boring games I've ever played. We can only guess at how much of that 36 and then 40 million went into licensing the engine, but it's safe to say a lot. When Amazon, you know, the richest company on Earth, licensed CryEngine, it only cost them $50 to $70 million. As you can probably gather, this is not exactly a cheap process. Valve releasing TF2's SDK for free for anyone to tinker with is, without hyperbole, absolutely insane. Trying to think of other things to compare this with to get across how ridiculous it is has been difficult because this is very possibly the most insane game you could ever think of to get this treatment. TF2 was supported for so long on one of the most beloved engines ever created and has more fans than Hong Kong apartments that I don't even know what to say. The only thing I can think of that would be kind of on par with this is like if WoW went open source, and even then it's not exactly an engine that people are clamoring to use. There's really no other game than TF2 that is this perfect Venn diagram of culturally relevant and popular, fun to play, and on an engine people actually want to use. Even if something like League went open source, the main game is so popular that it's all people would want to play. TF2 is already so focused on custom content, and has been for decades, that this is the perfect gift you could ever get as a modder. There were a few projects going around that I think might have sparked this, namely Open Fortress back in 2022. The project itself is kind of like if TF2 was designed like Quake, and in midway through 2022 they pretty much got cease and desisted out of nowhere. They called Valve's bluff and just put the game back up and never got punished for it, but as you can probably guess, that being able to happen at all led to a lot of confusion and discomfort for anyone looking to make a mod for TF2, knowing it might just get obliviated by Valve for any reason at any time. Now that the SDK is just available, this will probably never happen again, as Valve will open up an actual process to get stuff opened up on Steam. Theoretically, you won't have to do some archaic Steam launcher hack to get something like Open Fortress working anymore. You'll just, like, have a Steam store page. Another thing that I think sparked this was the TF2 code leak back in 2020. TF2's source code was technically already available, but unofficially. TF2 up until the Tough Break update was leaked online, and it spawned a wave of worries about people getting hacked or whatever. Nothing ended up coming from it, but you couldn't publicly use any of the things in this leak or you would be met with legal action from Valve, as it is literally stolen. Now the SDK is available publicly, not only is it much easier to work with, anyone can touch it commercially, which means publicly. Even though all of this was technically possible before, now it's possible, supported, and available. For free, for everyone. I will eventually probably make a why I have 3,000 hours in TF2 video if people ask for it. There's just so much to cover that just selecting what aspects of the game deserve highlighting, tell me in the comments by the way, is so daunting that I haven't ever dared touch the project folder for it. Not only that, but the production quality in the TF2 sphere has gotten absurdly high over the years, which makes it hard to compete. Regardless, it's a game I hold near and dear to my heart, but I'm strangely happy to see it over. Or rather, entering a new stage of its life. I hope the Save TF2 people will eventually find their medication and stop poisoning any discourse for the game, especially now that you have to accept that Valve isn't coming back to this one. You also need to accept that that's actually okay. A veritable golden age of community-created content is very likely to be upon us very soon, and TF2 has thrived on that for its whole life. It'll be better kept in the hands of the people who love it, rather than a disillusioned parent. We can only hope that the other TF2 may get the same treatment someday. Until then, I shall have to work on Lancerfall myself. I love TF2, and I'm glad this video gave me another excuse to play it again. It may have the recipe for the perfect competitive game inside of it, FUNKe video here by the way, but that potential was unfortunately lost back in 2016. It was definitely possible to retrofit the game into a competitive environment, but the sheer scale of that task was so large that Valve didn't bother, and honestly that was probably the right call. To make TF2 work as a properly competitive game with everything viable where you didn't have to utilize esoteric rule sets would probably take an entire redesign of the game from the ground up. To do that would not only take years, but may have ended up with a result that wasn't even better than what they started with, and inevitably would only make people upset. So, Valve accepted that and gave it one last send-off with Jungle Inferno, and this is technically speculation, but almost certainly true, the TF team then moved on to work on Deadlock instead, something they could actually design from the ground up to be competitively viable. Video on that here, by the way, and FUNKe also released an excellent one on the same topic recently. I am glad TF2 stayed as is, a silly casual game with an unbelievable skill cap, rather than forced through the meat grinder to become competitively viable like all of its competitors. I say this as someone who has actually played TF2 competitively as well. It's an excellent competitive experience, but trying to officially support it would have been a nightmare, as Valve would have had to make two entirely separate games to keep everyone happy. A casual version with all the silly stuff like Bonk, and a competitive version which would look so unbelievably different that it might as well be a different game. Trying to make Spy competitively viable is a task that I think is actually impossible, so it would, without hyperbole, be a completely different game. I suspect them trying to do this eventually morphed into Deadlock. Honestly, probably for the best. Thanks to my patrons, Emmy and Potato especially. Like, comment, subscribe, you know the drill, and have a good night.